I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The South was in a state of chaos in the 1960s. The Ku Klux Klan, along with law enforcement, constantly terrorized African Americans and other minorities using both violence and threats. Many Southerners were horrified at the idea of equality between African Americans and whites. One man was determined to end segregation, and his name was John F. Kennedy.
Born in Massachusetts on May 29, 1917, John F. Kennedy was one of 7 children. In 1941, in the midst of World War II, Kennedy served in the Navy. Specifically, he served in the PT boat duty as part of PT 109, where he fought in the Solomon Islands. Kennedy was a Harvard graduate as well, with a Bachelor in Arts and Government, graduating in 1940. Kennedy was then elected as a New York Senator in 1953. He then proceeded to run for president. John F. Kennedy was elected president on November 8, 1960, defeating Republican Richard Nixon and becoming the youngest elected president in the first Roman Catholic.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
During his early presidency, Kennedy backed away from civil rights, trying not to anger Southerners. Civil rights at the time had many facets, such as the NAACP, SCLC, and the SNCC. There were also some well-known civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks. These organizations and leaders participated and organized civil rights demonstrations, such as sit-ins and freedom rides. Sit-ins are where African Americans would protest by refusing to leave restaurants that would refuse to serve them. Freedom rides were when civil rights activists would ride buses into the segregated South to enforce the integration of public transportation. Although there were many efforts from civil rights organizations, executive power was needed to make real change.
One of the first challenges John F. Kennedy faced was when James Meredith applied to Ole Miss. Until this controversy, Ole Miss was an all-white school. In January of 1961, James Meredith applied to Ole Miss. After being denied entry into the school, Meredith and the NAACP filed a lawsuit against the university that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of James Meredith in September of 1962. The school attempted to rebuff the Supreme Court's ruling. Thus, the Kennedy administration was forced to send federal marshals to protect Meredith. A riot erupted when Meredith arrived at the University of Mississippi, consisting of around 2,000 students, and 2 people were killed and many injured in the ensuing chaos. National Guardsmen were later sent to Mississippi to greet an astounding 31,000 stationed troops. Meredith was shot in the neck during the pandemonium. Thankfully, despite the pushback, Meredith successfully enrolled in Ole Miss on October 1, 1962. This was the first integration of a major university, all thanks to JFK.
After the successful integration of Ole Miss, John F. Kennedy announced a new Fair Housing Act. Kennedy issued Executive Order 11063 on November 20, 1962, preventing racial discrimination in the sale or lease of housing facilities owned or operated by the federal government or housing built or purchased with federal aid. This was one of the many times JFK stood up to segregation. Another occurrence of college integration not going smoothly was at the University of Alabama. At the time, in 1963, Alabama was the only state to not integrate their school system. On the morning of June 11th, Vivian Malone Jones, Dave McLaughlin, and James Hood, all African American students, were stopped at the door by Governor George Wallace. Wallace stood at the door with the Alabama state trooper at his back and refused to let the students in. This is when he gave his famous stand at the door speech.
Constitution of the United States, and now being mindful of my duties and responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of Alabama, and seeking to preserve and maintain the peace and dignity of this state and the individual freedoms of the citizens thereof, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
Governor Wallace, I take it from that statement that you are...
President John F. Kennedy was then forced to up the pressure on Wallace. Immediately after Wallace's stand, JFK proceeded to issue Presidential Proclamation 3542, which ordered Wallace to stand down. Wallace and his accomplices were obstructing justice and civil rights progress by defying the president. He also used Executive Order 111111 to federalize the Alabama National Guard through the Secretary of Defense. George Wallace finally relented and allowed the students to be admitted to the University of Alabama. That same day, on June 11, 1963, John F. Kennedy gave his famous Civil Rights Address. He gave his powerful speech the same day as he successfully integrated the University of Alabama. The influential speech was only partly written when Kennedy started to speak.
On the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students at the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free.
After the speech, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "It was one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and the freedom of all men ever made by any president." This speech was one of the hallmarks of John F. Kennedy's presidency and a hallmark of the fight for civil rights. In his speech, he promised to propose a bill on desegregation. Only 8 days later, on June 19, 1963, he delivered on his promise. He sends the most comprehensive civil rights bill ever to Congress for approval. The bill protected voting rights, desegregated public places, empowered the Attorney General to desegregate schools, formed a community relations service, extended the life of the Commission on Civil Rights, prohibited federal funding of programs that practiced discrimination, and guaranteed equal employment. But there was still a long road ahead to pass the bill. After the bombings in September in Birmingham, Alabama, addendums were made by Northern Democrats to the bill. Despite this, JFK knew the bill would not pass, so he gathered influential congressmen and edited the bill to fulfill their needs. His efforts paid off, and on October 29th, the House passed the bill. Sadly, 2 weeks later, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States is killed.
President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, as he rode through Dealey Plaza in his motorcade. Lee Harvey Oswald fatally shot the president at 12:30. Kennedy was immediately rushed to Dallas's Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead a half hour after being shot. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, was rushed to Air Force One, where he was sworn in at 2:38 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, but only after he killed an officer attempting to question him. As Harvey was being moved to a secure facility with cameras rolling, Jack Ruby shot Oswald out of passion for the president. That same day, on November 24th, Kennedy's casket was moved from the White House to the Capitol Rotunda by horse-drawn carriage, where 250,000 people paid their respects. Now it was time for Lyndon B. Johnson to get to work. As a way to honor Kennedy and continue his legacy, Johnson supported Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill and signed it into law on July 2, 1964. Unbeknownst to most, earlier that year, the 24th Amendment, which prohibited poll taxes, was ratified under Kennedy. Who knows what Kennedy could have accomplished given more time? What we do know is that John F. Kennedy's legacy as a true leader of not only civil rights but democracy will live forever.